Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Quiet Life. Wilson Waters wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he finished repairing the fence post on his 40-acre farm in rural Tennessee. At 55, his hands were calloused from years of honest work, but beneath the farmer's exterior lay muscles that hadn't forgotten their deadly training. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the rolling pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully, a far cry from the war zones he'd once called home. Another beautiful day in paradise, he muttered to himself, a habit he developed during his 20 years with the agency. Back then, talking to himself had been a way to stay sane during months-long deep-cover operations in places that didn't exist on any official map. The screen door slammed as his wife, Rhonda, emerged from their modest farmhouse, her phone pressed to her ear. Even at 48, she maintained the sharp beauty that had first caught his attention 15 years ago in a D.C. coffee shop. He'd been on medical leave then, recovering from shrapnel wounds earned in a classified operation in Eastern Europe. She'd been working as a real estate agent, ambitious and hungry for success. "I told you, Margaret, the property values here are going nowhere," Rhonda said into her phone, not acknowledging Wilson's presence. "I'm wasting my best years in this backwater." Wilson's jaw tightened. He'd given up everything for this woman, his career, his purpose, his identity. When they married, he told her he worked in government consulting, a vague enough description that she'd never pressed for details. The CIA had been happy to let him disappear after the Sarajevo incident left 3 operatives dead and Wilson questioning everything he believed in. Margaret Koch, Rhonda's sister, had been filling her head with poison for years. While Wilson had built their modest but comfortable life through honest work, Margaret lived in luxury in Nashville, married to a corrupt city councilman who'd made his fortune through backroom deals Wilson preferred not to think about. As evening approached, Wilson sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. These moments of peace had become his salvation, replacing the adrenaline rush of explosives and the constant threat of death. He convinced himself this quiet life was enough. Inside, he could hear Rhonda on another phone call, her voice carrying through the thin walls. I know, but he's getting older, and he's got that life insurance policy." "No, Margaret, I can't just leave him. He'd get half of everything, including the farm. My lawyer already confirmed it." Wilson's blood ran cold. He'd installed surveillance equipment around the property years ago, old habits from a man trained to assume everyone was an enemy. But he'd never thought to monitor his own home. Until now, moving silently, a skill that had kept him alive in Kandahar and Damascus. Wilson slipped around to the side of the house where a small maintenance panel hid the recording equipment he'd installed for security. His fingers, steady despite the tremor of rage building in his chest, activated the audio enhancement system he'd built using components that officially didn't exist. "Just need to be smart about this," Rhonda was saying. "Make it look natural. An accident on the farm, maybe. Tractors are dangerous machines." Wilson closed his eyes, feeling the familiar coldness settle over him. The same detachment that had made him the CIA's most effective demolitions expert. In 18 years of marriage, she had never once asked about the scars that covered his back, or why he sometimes woke up screaming about places called Grozny and Fallujah. She'd been content to live off his modest government pension and the money he made from the farm, never curious about why a simple consultant received checks from so many different agencies. But now, as her words cut through the evening air like shards of glass, Wilson began to remember who he used to be. Before he became a farmer, before he became a husband, he'd been Operative Shadow, the man they sent when entire terrorist cells needed to disappear without a trace. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, using the voice that had once commanded respect in the world's darkest corners. "Tomorrow, we see what you're really made of, Rhonda." Chapter 2. The Price of Betrayal. Wilson didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study, a room Rhonda had never shown much interest in, assuming it contained nothing more than farming journals and tax records. In reality, it was a carefully maintained armory and intelligence center that would have impressed his former colleagues at Langley. Behind a false wall triggered by a sequence of touches that looked like nervous fidgeting, Wilson retrieved equipment he hadn't used in 15 years. The encrypted phone was still charged. These things were built to last decades in hostile environments. His hands moved with muscle memory as he activated listening devices, so small they could be mistaken for dust particles. At 3:17 a.m., his patience was rewarded. Rhonda's phone buzzed, and she answered with the hushed urgency of a conspirator. "It has to be tomorrow," came Margaret's voice through the enhanced audio. "Brett's in town, and he owes me a favor from that thing last year. He'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong." "Brett Wilkins?" Rhonda whispered. "Margaret, he's dangerous." What if nothing? You said yourself Wilson's getting suspicious. He's been asking questions about my husband's business, and Tony can't afford that kind of attention right now." Wilson's mind cataloged the information with practiced efficiency. Tony Khan, Margaret's husband and Nashville city councilman. Brett Wilkins, muscle for hire, probably with connections to Khan's dirty dealings. A web of corruption and greed that his wife had apparently been part of for years. Besides, Margaret continued, what's he going to do? Chase Brett with a pitchfork? He's just a broken-down old farmer who never amounted to anything. As dawn broke, Wilson watched Rhonda perform her morning routine with the clinical detachment he'd once reserved for enemy combatants. She made coffee, checked her makeup, and called in sick to her job at the local real estate office, all while planning his murder. "I'm going to visit Margaret today," she announced, not meeting his eyes. "Probably stay overnight. She's having troubles with Tony." "Of course," Wilson replied, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had held for 15 years. "Give her my regards." After Rhonda left, driving their sedan toward Nashville, Wilson began his preparations. From his hidden cache, he retrieved gear that brought back memories of missions in places the State Department officially denied existed. Body armor, communication equipment, and enough explosives to level a city block. But first, intelligence gathering. Wilson activated a tracing program on a secured laptop, using credentials that should have been deactivated years ago, but somehow remained active in the system. Within minutes, he had complete dossiers on Brett Wilkins, Tony Khan, and a network of associates that made his stomach turn. Brett Wilkins, 34, had served 2 tours in Iraq before being dishonorably discharged for conduct unbecoming. Since returning to civilian life, he'd worked as an enforcer for various criminal enterprises, always careful to stay just below the federal radar. 3 arrests, no convictions, and a reputation for making problems disappear. Tony Khan was worse, a man who'd built his fortune by selling city contracts to the highest bidder, regardless of safety or competency. The elementary school collapse 3 years ago that killed 2 children, that was Khan's contractor cutting corners on foundation work. The water treatment plant failure that sickened hundreds, Khan's brother-in-law's company, using substandard filtration systems. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, who'd always treated Wilson like he was beneath her notice. She was the architect of it all, using her charm and connections to facilitate her husband's corruption while maintaining the facade of respectability. As Wilson studied surveillance photos of the 3 conspirators meeting at an upscale Nashville restaurant, a plan began to form. Not the simple, efficient elimination he might have chosen in his agency days, but something more fitting, something that would expose their entire network while giving them exactly what they deserved. By noon, Wilson had made his decision. He wouldn't just survive Brett Wilkins' attack. He'd use it as the first move in a game his enemies couldn't possibly understand. They thought they were hunting a harmless farmer, but they'd awakened something far more dangerous. Wilson Waters the farmer was about to remember how to be Operative Shadow. And when Shadow went hunting, nobody survived by accident. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Trap. The morning sun cast long shadows across Wilson's farm as he made his final preparations. Brett Wilkins would come at dawn. Amateurs always did, thinking the early hour gave them an advantage. What they didn't understand was that Wilson had spent decades making dawn his hunting time. Using techniques learned in the mountains of Afghanistan, Wilson had transformed his peaceful farm into a battlefield that would give him every possible advantage. Pressure plates, hidden beneath natural-looking debris, would signal an intruder's approach. Motion sensors disguised as fence repairs would track movement patterns. And scattered throughout the property were devices that would turn the morning light itself into a weapon. At 5:43 a.m., Wilson's perimeter alarms activated. Through his thermal imaging scope, a piece of equipment that officially didn't exist, he watched a figure cut through the fence line exactly where he'd predicted. Brett Wilkins moved like a man accustomed to violence, but lacking in the refined skills that separated a killer from a soldier. Wilson remained perfectly still in his concealed position, watching as Brett approached the farmhouse. The man carried a .45 automatic and what looked like a crowbar, crude tools for a crude plan. Make it look like a robbery, kill the farmer, and disappear before anyone noticed. Simple, direct, and exactly what Wilson had hoped for. When Brett was 50 feet from the house, Wilson activated the first phase of his plan. A series of small explosive charges, positioned with mathematical precision, destroyed Brett's escape route while creating the illusion of a gas line explosion. Nothing lethal. Wilson needed his would-be assassin alive for what came next. "Jesus Christ!" Brett shouted, spinning toward the flames that now blocked his path to the road. In that moment of confusion, Wilson struck. 20 years of retirement hadn't slowed him down as much as he'd feared. Wilson emerged from concealment like a ghost, his movements flowing with the deadly grace that had once made him the CIA's most requested operative. Before Brett could react, Wilson's combat knife had parted the tendons in his gun hand, and a precise blow to the solar plexus dropped the younger man to his knees. "Brett Wilkins," Wilson said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Born in Memphis, dishonorably discharged for assaulting a superior officer, currently employed by Tony Khan to solve problems that voting can't fix. Brett's eyes widened as he struggled to breathe. This wasn't the broken-down farmer he'd been briefed on. This was something else entirely, something dangerous. "Here's what's going to happen," Wilson continued, binding Brett's wounds with field dressing techniques that kept him conscious but immobilized. "You're going to call Margaret Coke and tell her the job is done. You're going to describe finding my body in the barn, shot during what appeared to be a struggle. Can you do that, Brett?" The bound man nodded, terror replacing the casual arrogance he'd arrived with. "Good, because if you don't, I'll demonstrate some of the techniques I learned during my 20 years with the CIA. And trust me, after what I did to terrorists in places that don't appear on any map, what I'll do to you will seem creative by comparison." Wilson activated Brett's phone, holding it close enough for the man to speak, but maintaining complete control of the conversation. "It's done," Brett gasped when Margaret answered. "Found him in the barn. Must have heard me coming. He's dead." "Thank God," came Margaret's voice through the speaker. "And it looks like a robbery gone wrong, just like you wanted," Wilson interrupted, deepening his voice just enough to sound like a man in pain. "But we need to talk. In person." Things got complicated. After arranging to meet Margaret at a remote location, Wilson ended the call and looked down at his captive. Phase 1 complete. Now comes the interesting part. As Wilson prepared for the next stage of his plan, he reflected on how much his life had changed in the span of 24 hours. Yesterday, he'd been a simple farmer whose biggest concern was repairing fence posts. Today, he was once again Operative Shadow, and his enemies had no idea what they'd awakened. But they would learn. Before Wilson was finished, everyone who betrayed him would understand exactly who they'd been foolish enough to threaten. And their punishment would be as precise and devastating as every mission he'd ever completed for his country. The war had come to his farm, but Wilson Waters intended to finish it on his terms. Chapter 4. The Web Unravels. Wilson secured Brett in the storm shelter beneath his barn, a reinforced concrete bunker he'd built under the guise of tornado protection, but which actually served as a safe room equipped with communication gear and interrogation tools. The afternoon sun filtered through the barn's wooden slats as Wilson prepared for the next phase of his operation. "You know, Brett," Wilson said, adjusting the recording equipment he'd positioned around his captive, "in my former line of work, we had a saying, every thread leads somewhere. Right now, you're the thread I'm following to unravel Margaret and Tony's entire operation." Brett struggled against the restraints Wilson had fashioned from climbing gear. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Operative Shadow," Wilson interrupted. "That's who I used to be. Before I made the mistake of thinking I could have a normal life with a woman who saw me as nothing more than a meal ticket and a life insurance payout." Wilson activated a tablet, displaying surveillance photos he'd compiled over the past few hours. "See, while you were unconscious, I took the liberty of investigating your employers more thoroughly. Tony Khan's operation is impressive, corruption on a scale that would make a cartel boss proud." The photos showed Tony meeting with construction contractors, city officials, and men who looked like they'd be more comfortable in dark alleys than boardrooms. Wilson had used facial recognition software to identify most of them, building a comprehensive map of Nashville's underworld that reached into the highest levels of city government. "Margaret's the real brains of the operation," Wilson continued, enlarging a photo of his sister-in-law meeting with a man identified as Luther Montgomery, a known money launderer. "She coordinates everything: bribes, intimidation, elimination of obstacles. Like me, they'll kill you," Brett said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have no idea how connected they are." Wilson smiled, and Brett shivered at the coldness in his eyes. "Let me tell you a story about connections, Brett. 3 years ago, I was monitoring international chatter when I came across references to a Nashville operation moving money for some very bad people. Middle Eastern terrorist organizations, specifically. I assumed it was federal jurisdiction, not my concern anymore." He pulled up encrypted files on his tablet, information that should have been impossible for a retired operative to access. "But now I realize those references were Tony's operation. Your boss isn't just stealing from Nashville taxpayers, Brett. He's washing money for organizations that kill American soldiers." Brett's face went pale. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. You're just a muscle." "But Margaret knew. Tony knew. And they were planning to use my death to clean up loose ends before a federal task force could connect the dots." Wilson showed Brett bank records, communication intercepts, and financial transfers that painted a picture of treason disguised as municipal corruption. The elementary school that collapsed? Those weren't just substandard materials, Brett. That was deliberate sabotage designed to discredit American construction standards for an overseas client. The water treatment failure? Same thing. They've been selling our infrastructure vulnerabilities to the highest bidder. "Jesus," Brett whispered. "If the feds find out." "They already know," Wilson lied smoothly. "Why do you think I'm still alive?" "This isn't revenge, Brett. This is a sanctioned operation. I'm still CIA, and my retirement was just deep cover to investigate this network." The lie was so perfectly crafted that Wilson almost believed it himself. In reality, he was completely off the books, using skills and resources that were supposed to be forgotten. But Brett didn't need to know that. "Here's your choice," Wilson continued. "Help me bring down this network, and I'll make sure the Justice Department knows you cooperated. Refuse, and you'll be listed as a co-conspirator in a treason case that carries the death penalty." Brett's resolve crumbled completely. "What do you need me to do?" Wilson handed him a secure phone. "Call Margaret. Tell her you need to meet tonight instead of tomorrow. Tell her I fought harder than expected, and there are complications that require immediate attention." As Brett made the call, Wilson felt the familiar thrill of a complex operation falling into place. Margaret agreed to the meeting, her greed and paranoia making her susceptible to manipulation. She suggested meeting at Tony's construction yard, an isolated location where they'd feel secure, but which Wilson had already scouted and prepared. "Good," Wilson said after Brett ended the call. "Now let me explain what's going to happen tonight. Margaret and Tony think they're meeting with you to clean up loose ends from my murder. Instead, they're walking into a trap 20 years in the making." Wilson began checking his equipment: body armor, communication gear, recording devices, and enough explosive charges to turn Tony's construction yard into a crater. But this wouldn't be about explosions. This would be about justice, carefully measured and precisely delivered. "One more thing, Brett," Wilson said as he prepared to leave for the meeting. "If you're thinking about warning them, Remember that I spent 2 decades making very dangerous people disappear without a trace. The only reason you're still breathing is because you're useful to me. Stop being useful, and I'll demonstrate exactly what I learned about making problems vanish permanently. As evening approached, Wilson felt the transformation completing itself. The farmer was gone, consumed by the predator he'd tried so hard to bury. Operative Shadow was back, and tonight, his enemies would learn why he'd once been considered the most dangerous man in the CIA's arsenal. Chapter 5: The Reckoning Begins. The construction yard sprawled across 10 acres of industrial wasteland on the outskirts of Nashville, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Wilson arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, using the cover of darkness to position himself and his equipment with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. From his vantage point atop a crane operator's booth, Wilson had a clear view of the entire complex. Motion sensors placed around the perimeter would track every arrival, while directional microphones would capture every whispered conversation. Most importantly, the explosive charges he'd carefully positioned would turn the construction yard into a controlled environment where his enemies could be managed like pieces on a chessboard. At exactly 9:15 p.m., Margaret's silver BMW pulled through the main gate, followed by Tony's ostentatious Cadillac Escalade and a third vehicle Wilson didn't recognize, a black sedan that screamed federal government. His pulse quickened as he adjusted his scope to identify the sedan's occupants. Luther Montgomery emerged from the driver's seat, but it was the passenger who made Wilson's blood run cold. A woman in her 40s, moving with the controlled precision of a trained operative. Through his scope's image enhancement, Wilson could make out federal credentials hanging from her jacket. Special Agent Julia O'Donnell, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Wilson knew her by reputation, a relentless investigator who'd brought down senators and cabinet members. If she was here, it meant the federal net was already closing around Tony's operation. Well, Wilson murmured into his throat mic, recording everything for posterity. Looks like my little family reunion just became a federal case. Through his directional microphones, Wilson listened as the 3 groups converged near Tony's office trailer. Margaret looked nervous, constantly checking her phone for word from Brett. Tony appeared agitated, his usual bluster replaced by the twitchy paranoia of a man who knew he was in serious trouble. "Where the hell is Wilkins?" Tony demanded. "He should have been here an hour ago." "He called," Margaret said, her voice tight with stress. "Said there were complications with the farmer. Maybe Wilson fought back harder than expected." Agent O'Donnell stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "Mr. Khan, Mrs. Koch, we need to discuss your relationship with several overseas financial institutions. Specifically, transactions that appear to violate the Patriot Act and multiple Wilson watched through his scope as Tony and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd walked into a federal trap, but they didn't yet understand how deep they were buried. "I want my lawyer," Tony said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's your right," O'Donnell replied. "But first, let's talk about Wilson Waters. We know you've been investigating him, and we know why." Wilson's breath caught. How much did the FBI know about his past? How long had they been watching his wife's conspiracy? "Wilson Waters is a problem," Margaret said, apparently deciding cooperation was her best option. "He's been asking questions about Tony's business, making connections he shouldn't make." Because Wilson Waters is a 20-year veteran of CIA Special Operations, O'Donnell said calmly. "The man you've been plotting to murder is one of the most decorated covert operatives in American history." The silence that followed was profound. Wilson watched as Margaret and Tony processed the magnitude of their mistake. They tried to kill a man who'd spent 2 decades eliminating America's enemies, and now they were facing the full weight of federal law enforcement. "We can make a deal," O'Donnell continued. "Full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentences. But first, I need to know, where is Wilson Waters now?" Wilson smiled grimly as he activated the next phase of his plan. Using a voice modulator to disguise his identity, he patched into their communication frequency. "Wilson Waters is exactly where he needs to be, came his electronically altered voice through their radios and phones simultaneously. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? Chaos erupted in the construction yard as security lights blazed to life, illuminated by Wilson's remote triggers. The three groups scattered, seeking cover behind equipment and vehicles while trying to locate the source of the transmission. "This is Agent O'Donnell, FBI," came the shout over a megaphone that hadn't been there moments before. Wilson had positioned it as part of his preparation. "Wilson Waters, identify yourself." "Agent O'Donnell," Wilson replied, his modified voice echoing across the yard. "I believe you'll find that Margaret Koch and Tony Khan have just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and providing material support to terrorist organizations. I trust the Bureau has sufficient evidence to proceed with arrests." Wilson watched as O'Donnell signaled her backup team, agents who'd been positioned outside the yard but were now moving in to secure the perimeter. She'd been using the construction yard meeting as the final piece of evidence needed to conclude a much larger federal investigation. "We do," O'Donnell confirmed. "Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation?" Wilson's response was to activate the final component of his trap. The explosive charges he'd positioned weren't designed to harm. They were shaped to create walls of flame that would prevent escape while leaving clear paths for federal agents to make arrests. As Margaret and Tony found themselves surrounded by fire and federal agents, Wilson began his own extraction. He'd accomplished his primary objective, exposing the network that had betrayed him while ensuring they faced justice that was both legal and complete. But the night was far from over. Wilson still had one more betrayer to confront, and Rhonda Waters had no idea that her husband was very much alive and coming home. Chapter 6: The Truth About Rhonda. Wilson slipped away from the construction yard as federal agents took Margaret and Tony into custody, their shouts and protestations fading into the distance. Agent O'Donnell had her arrests, and the financial crimes investigation that had been building for months finally had the evidence it needed. But Wilson's personal mission was only half complete. The drive back to his farm gave him time to process what he'd learned. The FBI had been watching Tony's operation for at least a year, which meant they'd also been monitoring his wife's involvement in the conspiracy. Agent O'Donnell's presence hadn't been coincidental. The Bureau had been using Margaret and Tony's desperation to eliminate Wilson as the final piece of evidence they needed. Back at his farm, Wilson found Brett Wilkins exactly where he'd left him, secured in the storm shelter, but now significantly more cooperative. The sound of distant explosions and sirens had convinced the hired killer that his employers were finished. "They're all in federal custody," Wilson told him, settling into a chair across from his captive. "Margaret, Tony, Luther Montgomery, and about half a dozen others. Agent O'Donnell sends her thanks for your unintentional cooperation." Brett's face crumpled. "What happens to me?" "That depends on how helpful you are with what comes next," Wilson replied. "Tell me about Rhonda's involvement in this operation. I know she wasn't just a victim of Margaret's manipulation." Brett hesitated, then began talking with the desperate honesty of a man who'd realized his life depended on cooperation. "It started 2 years ago. Margaret approached Rhonda about selling her farm. Said the property had mineral rights that could be worth millions if the right buyers could be found." Wilson's jaw tightened. He'd bought the farm specifically because geological surveys indicated no valuable minerals beneath it, a perfect place for a man trying to disappear from the intelligence world. "Go on." "Rhonda was already unhappy," Brett continued. "Said she'd married beneath herself, that you were holding her back from the life she deserved. Margaret convinced her that the farm sale could be her way out, but only if she could get it without splitting the proceeds in a divorce." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The life insurance policy. $2 million, Brett confirmed. Taken out 3 years ago when you had that health scare. Double indemnity for accidental death. Margaret had it all planned out. Your death, the insurance payout, and then the mineral rights sale would set both sisters up for life. Wilson remembered the health scare, a minor heart episode brought on by stress and too many years of living on adrenaline and caffeine. Rhonda had been so supportive then, insisting on the life insurance policy for security. He'd been touched by her concern for their future together. "There are no mineral rights," Wilson said. "We know that now." But Margaret had Luther Montgomery create fake geological surveys, fictional buyer interest, the whole thing. The plan was to use your death to force a quick sale to buyers who didn't exist, then disappear with the insurance money before anyone discovered the fraud. Wilson stood and paced the small bunker, his mind working through the implications. "How long has Rhonda known about my CIA background?" Brett's expression grew uncomfortable. "She's always suspected something. The scars, the way you wake up sometimes, the fact that your government pension is more than most consultants make. But she never cared enough to investigate until Margaret convinced her it might be a problem. A problem if you really were CIA, killing you might bring federal attention they couldn't afford. But Margaret found out about the Sarajevo incident through her connections, how you lost your team and got forced into retirement. She convinced Rhonda that you were washed up, discredited, forgotten by the agency. Just a broken-down ex-spook with no friends left in Washington." Wilson closed his eyes, remembering Sarajevo. 3 good agents dead because of intelligence failures and political maneuvering beyond their control. He'd been the sole survivor, and the blame had followed him into retirement despite official exoneration. Margaret had done her homework, understanding exactly how isolated he'd become. "She's at Margaret's house now?" Wilson asked. "Probably celebrating your death while waiting for news about the arrests," Brett said. Neither of them expected federal involvement. They thought this was just local corruption that could be managed. Wilson activated his secure communication array and began monitoring law enforcement frequencies. The arrests at the construction yard had triggered a massive federal operation. Search warrants being served across Nashville, assets being frozen, and a network of corruption being systematically dismantled. "Agent O'Donnell," he said into his encrypted phone, reaching the FBI investigator directly. "Mr. Waters, I was hoping you'd call. We need to discuss your wife's involvement in this conspiracy." "I'm aware of her role," Wilson replied. "What I need to know is whether she's been taken into custody yet." "Not yet. We're waiting for you to make contact with her. Federal prosecutors want to offer her a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against a larger network." Wilson considered this. The law wanted justice, but it also wanted efficiency. Rhonda could provide evidence that would ensure convictions and longer sentences for the real criminals. In exchange, she'd probably serve minimal time in federal prison. "No deal," Wilson said firmly. "Rhonda planned my murder. Whatever else she knows about Tony and Margaret's operation, she crossed a line that doesn't allow for plea bargaining." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Waters, I understand your anger, but Agent O'Donnell, with respect, you don't understand anything yet. Give me 12 hours before making any deals with my wife. After that, I guarantee you'll have more evidence against her than any plea agreement could provide." Wilson ended the call and looked at Brett, who'd been listening with growing alarm. "Here's what's going to happen," Wilson said. "You're going to help me show Rhonda exactly what kind of man she tried to kill. And then we're going to let her make a choice about how this ends." The farmer was gone completely now. Operative Shadow had returned, and he intended to finish this mission with the same precision and thoroughness that had made him legendary in the intelligence community. Rhonda had betrayed him for money, but she was about to learn that some betrayals carried a price that couldn't be calculated in dollars. Chapter 7. The Homecoming. At 11:47 p.m., Rhonda Waters pulled into her driveway, her hands still shaking from the phone calls that had shattered her carefully constructed world. Margaret arrested, Tony in federal custody, their entire operation exposed and dismantled by the FBI. And somehow, impossibly, Wilson was still alive. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the darkened farmhouse that had been her prison for 15 years. The police scanner app on her phone crackled with reports of search warrants, asset seizures, and a federal investigation that had apparently been building for months. Margaret's hysterical phone call from custody had been nearly incomprehensible, but certain words had come through clearly. Say, operative 20 years, and most terrifyingly, he knows everything. The front porch light flickered on as Rhonda approached the house, followed by lights in the living room and kitchen. Wilson was home, alive, and waiting for her. She considered running, Her BMW had a full tank of gas, and she had enough cash hidden in her purse to disappear for weeks. But where could she go? If Wilson really was CIA, if he really was the deadly operative Margaret had described in her panicked ramblings, then running would only delay the inevitable. "Hello, Rhonda," came Wilson's voice from the darkness of the front porch. "Come inside. We have a lot to discuss." She found him sitting at their kitchen table, hands folded calmly in front of him. He looked exactly the same as he had that morning when she'd kissed his cheek and wished him a good day while planning his murder. But something fundamental had changed in his eyes. The warmth and trust that had defined their marriage for 15 years had been replaced by something cold and calculating. "Wilson," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "I heard about Margaret and Tony. It's terrible. I can't believe they were involved in." "Sit down," he said quietly, and the command carried such authority that she obeyed without conscious thought. "We both know why you're here, and we both know what you did. The only question now is what happens next." Wilson activated a tablet on the table, displaying audio waveforms and timestamps. "At 3:17 this morning, you received a call from Margaret Koch. You discussed hiring Brett Wilkins to kill me and make it appear to be a robbery. At 9:43 a.m., you called Margaret to confirm that the plan was proceeding. At 11:15 a.m., you called your insurance agent to verify the details of my life insurance policy." Rhonda's face went pale as Wilson played back portions of each recorded conversation, her own voice clearly audible as she planned his death with casual efficiency. "I've been monitoring our home communications for 2 years, Rhonda. Ever since I began suspecting that your late-night phone calls with Margaret weren't just sisterly conversations about real estate markets and social gossip." "Wilson, you don't understand." "Understand perfectly," he interrupted. "You married me because you thought I was a successful government consultant with good earning potential and a secure retirement. When that didn't provide the lifestyle you felt you deserved, Margaret convinced you that I was an obstacle to the wealth you could obtain from selling this farm under fraudulent pretenses." Wilson stood and moved to the kitchen counter, where several manila folders lay waiting. "But you never bothered to learn who you actually married, did you? You never asked about the scars or the nightmares or why a simple consultant receives payment from 17 different government agencies." He placed the first folder in front of her. It contained military service records, commendations, and mission reports from his 2 decades with the CIA. Rhonda's eyes widened as she read about operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and a dozen other countries where Operative Shadow had eliminated threats to American security. 20 years, Wilson said, his voice emotionless. 217 confirmed kills. 43 terrorist cells eliminated. 15 international kidnapping operations resolved with 0 casualties among the hostages. I was the man they sent when diplomacy failed and military action was too public. The second folder contained financial records showing the true scope of Wilson's government pension and disability payments. "I'm not a broken-down farmer, Rhonda. I'm a retired intelligence operative who chose this life because I thought I could trust the woman I married to value the peace we built together over the money she could get from destroying it." Rhonda stared at the documents, her careful facade finally crumbling. "Margaret said you were washed up, discredited. She said the government had thrown you away after some mission went wrong." "Sarajevo," Wilson confirmed. "I lost 3 agents because of intelligence failures and political interference. The official investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, but I'd had enough of watching good people die for bad reasons. So I retired, married you, and tried to build something meaningful with what was left of my life." Wilson opened the third folder, revealing surveillance photos of Margaret, Tony, and their criminal network. "What I didn't know was that my wife saw our marriage as a temporary inconvenience until something better came along. What I didn't expect was that she'd be willing to have me murdered for life insurance money and fake mineral rights that don't exist." "They don't exist," Rhonda whispered. "Margaret lied to you about everything. The geological surveys, the interested buyers, the potential value of this property, all fabricated to convince you that killing me would be profitable. In reality, You were going to be left with $2 million in insurance money and a worthless piece of farmland while Margaret and Tony disappeared with the funds they've been stealing from Nashville taxpayers. Wilson sat back down across from her, his expression unreadable. So here's what's going to happen, Rhonda. You have two choices, and you have exactly 60 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether you live or die. The kitchen grew deathly quiet except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock Wilson's father had given him as a wedding present. Rhonda looked into her husband's eyes and saw no trace of the gentle, patient man she'd married. In his place sat someone she'd never met, a predator capable of violence beyond her imagination. Choose wisely, Wilson said as the clock continued its relentless countdown, because this is the only mercy you'll receive from the man you try to kill. Chapter 8, The Final Gambit. 60 seconds, Rhonda, Wilson repeated, his voice carrying the same deadly calm he'd once used to interrogate captured terrorists. Choice 1. You cooperate fully with the federal investigation. You testify against Margaret and Tony, provide complete financial records of your involvement in their operation, and plead guilty to conspiracy charges. In exchange, I'll recommend leniency to the prosecutors. Rhonda's hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the table. And choice 2. Wilson's smile was utterly without warmth. Choice 2 is that you continue lying, deny your involvement, and force me to demonstrate exactly what I learned during 20 years of making America's enemies disappear permanently. He leaned forward, and Rhonda could see the predator that had terrified terrorists across 3 continents. I know about the offshore accounts, Rhonda. I know about the money Margaret has been funneling through your real estate transactions for the past 2 years. I know about the construction contract you helped arrange through your professional connections. And I know about the federal building safety inspection reports you falsified to help Tony's substandard work pass regulatory review. Each revelation hit Rhonda like a physical blow. She'd thought her involvement had been minimal, limited to facilitating Margaret's schemes while maintaining plausible deniability. Now she realized that Wilson had been watching, recording, documenting everything with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operative. The children who died in that elementary school collapse. Wilson continued relentlessly. Their blood is on your hands, Rhonda. You signed off on the safety inspections that approved Tony's shoddy foundation work. You knew the materials were substandard, and you approved them anyway because Margaret was paying you $5,000 per falsified report. I didn't know anyone would get hurt, Rhonda whispered, but even as she said it, she knew how hollow it sounded. 30 seconds, Wilson said, consulting the stopwatch on his tablet. Federal prosecutors are prepared to charge you with conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, racketeering, and negligent homicide in the deaths of those children. Without cooperation, you're looking at life in federal prison. With cooperation, you might see freedom again before you're 70. Rhonda closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of her situation. The life she'd built, the future she'd envisioned, the escape she'd planned, all of it was collapsing around her like the elementary school that had killed 2 innocent children because of her greed. What kind of cooperation? She asked, her voice barely audible. Complete and total, Wilson replied. Financial records, communication logs, names of everyone involved in the network, details of every illegal transaction you facilitated. You become the prosecution's star witness against Margaret, Tony, and everyone else involved in this operation. And if I do that, you'll really recommend leniency? Wilson's expression didn't change. I'll tell the prosecutors that you cooperated fully and expressed genuine remorse for your actions. Whether that translates to leniency will depend on how valuable your testimony proves to be. Time, Wilson announced, though Rhonda couldn't tell if 60 seconds had actually elapsed. What's your decision? Before Rhonda could answer, the kitchen window exploded inward as a smoke grenade rolled across the floor. Wilson was already moving, drawing a pistol from a shoulder holster Rhonda hadn't even noticed and positioning himself between her and the window. Federal agents, came Agent O'Donnell's voice through a megaphone outside. Wilson Waters, we have a warrant for your arrest. Exit the house with your hands visible. Wilson cursed under his breath. Someone had convinced the FBI that he was holding Rhonda hostage, forcing a tactical response that would complicate everything he'd been working toward. "They think I'm the threat," Wilson said, his mind already working through tactical options. "Someone convinced them that I've gone rogue, that I'm using CIA training to take revenge on civilians." Through the smoke, Rhonda could see armed figures moving around the perimeter of the house. Wilson had been preparing for confrontation with criminals and conspirators, not federal agents operating under lawful authority. "There's a third choice, isn't there?" Rhonda said, sudden understanding dawning in her voice. "You never intended to let me walk away from this." Wilson looked at her, and for just a moment, she saw a flash of the man she'd married, hurt, betrayed, and utterly heartbroken by what she'd done to their life together. "No," he said quietly. "I never did." The tactical team began their entry, smoke and flashbang grenades turning the peaceful farmhouse into a combat zone. Wilson moved with the fluid precision of his CIA training, but he wasn't trying to escape or resist arrest. Instead, he was positioning himself and Rhonda in a specific location, using the chaos to execute one final phase of his plan. "Wilson Waters." Agent O'Donnell's voice echoed through the smoke. "Surrender now. We have the house surrounded." Wilson activated a device on his belt, and suddenly every electronic system in the house came alive. Lights, speakers, televisions, and computers all began broadcasting simultaneously, flooding the tactical frequency with a single message. "Agent O'Donnell, this is Wilson Waters. I'm not holding hostages. I'm not a threat to federal agents. Check your secure communication channel for a complete intelligence package documenting the criminal conspiracy that targeted me for assassination. Everything you need to complete your investigation is waiting for your review." As federal agents stormed through the smoke-filled kitchen, Wilson placed his weapon on the table and raised his hands. But his eyes remained fixed on Rhonda, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. "You planned this," she whispered. "All of it, even getting arrested." Wilson's smile was cold and final. 20 years in the CIA teaches you to always have an exit strategy, Rhonda, even when the exit leads exactly where you want to be. The tactical team reached them, weapons trained on Wilson as Agent O'Donnell moved to secure the scene. But Wilson's attention remained focused on his wife, who was finally beginning to understand the true scope of the trap she'd walked into. The game was nearly over, but Operative Shadow had one final move to make. Chapter 9, Justice Served. 6 months later, Wilson Waters sat in the witness room of the federal courthouse in Nashville, reviewing his testimony one final time before the sentencing hearing. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the courtroom filling with reporters, federal prosecutors, and families of the victims whose lives had been destroyed by Margaret Koch and Tony Khan's criminal enterprise. The investigation that followed his arrest had been swift and devastating. Wilson's intelligence package, compiled during his years of quiet observation and delivered to the FBI at precisely the right moment, had provided federal prosecutors with evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of Nashville's government. 27 people had been arrested, including judges, city councilmen, construction contractors, and financial intermediaries who'd helped launder money for international terrorist organizations. Agent O'Donnell entered the witness room, looking tired but satisfied. "The jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts," she reported. "Margaret gets life without parole for the terrorist financing charges. Tony got 45 years for the racketeering and negligent homicide convictions. Luther Montgomery turned state's evidence and will serve 15 years in federal prison." "And Rhonda?" Wilson asked, though he already knew the answer. 25 years for conspiracy, money laundering, and negligent homicide. She'll be eligible for parole in 12 years if she maintains her cooperation with ongoing investigations. Wilson nodded. It was more mercy than his wife had shown him, but less than she'd expected when she'd agreed to testify against her co-conspirators. The families of the children killed in the elementary school collapse had attended every day of her trial, their presence a constant reminder of the human cost of her greed. "There's something else," O'Donnell continued. "The director wants to meet with you. Unofficially, of course." Wilson wasn't surprised. His handling of the situation had been unorthodox but effective, demonstrating skills and resources that the intelligence community thought had been lost when he retired. The kind of comprehensive investigation he'd conducted, and the precision with which he'd exposed an entire criminal network, was exactly what the CIA needed in an era of increasingly complex threats. "I'm retired," Wilson said, but without the finality the words had carried 6 months ago. "Are you?" O'Donnell asked. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you just conducted one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in recent memory. And you did it while operating completely off the books, using nothing but your own resources and initiative." Wilson considered this. The past 6 months had reminded him of who he used to be, and more importantly, who he still was beneath the farmer's facade. The quiet life he'd built with Rhonda had been based on a lie, but that didn't mean he couldn't build something meaningful from the wreckage of their marriage. What does the director have in mind? A consulting position. Part-time, project-based work. The kind of assignments that require someone with your particular skills and experience. You'd keep the farm, maintain your cover as a retired government worker, but you'd be available when we need someone who can operate in situations too sensitive for official CIA involvement. Wilson looked out the courthouse window at the rolling Tennessee hills he'd come to love. The farm represented peace, simplicity, and the hope that he could leave the violence of his past behind. But it also represented the life he'd shared with a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than an obstacle to her ambitions. "I'll need guarantees," Wilson said. "Complete operational autonomy, choice of assignments, and absolute anonymity. My involvement never appears in any official records." O'Donnell smiled. The director anticipated those conditions. "He also authorized me to mention that we have several ongoing investigations that could benefit from your unique perspective on criminal networks that cross the line into terrorism." As they spoke, Brett Wilkins was escorted past the witness room in handcuffs and leg shackles. The hired killer had received 15 years for conspiracy and weapons charges, a relatively light sentence in exchange for his cooperation in exposing the network's connections to organized crime in Memphis and Atlanta. He caught sight of Wilson through the glass and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement between men who'd both made choices that led them to this courthouse, though only one of them had chosen wisely. "There's one more thing," O'Donnell said as they prepared to leave. "We found evidence that Margaret and Tony were planning to expand their operation to other cities. Similar schemes involving municipal corruption, construction fraud, and money laundering for foreign clients. Without your intervention, they could have been responsible for hundreds of deaths in failed infrastructure projects across the Southeast." Wilson stood and straightened his tie, the same conservative navy blue he'd worn to testify at his wife's trial. In 6 months, he'd gone from a man whose greatest concern was repairing fence posts to someone who'd single-handedly dismantled a criminal conspiracy that threatened national security. "Agent O'Donnell," he said as they walked toward the courtroom, "when you speak to the director, tell him that Wilson Waters is still retired, but Operative Shadow is available for consultation on a case-by-case basis." The courtroom was packed as Wilson took the witness stand one final time, not to testify about his wife's crimes, but to receive recognition from the federal prosecutors who'd relied on his intelligence work to secure their convictions. The judge commended his civic duty and professional expertise in exposing a network of corruption that posed a clear and present danger to public safety. As Wilson left the courthouse, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from betrayed husband to federal hero. Rhonda had seen him as a broken-down old farmer whose only value was the insurance money his death would provide. Instead, she discovered that she'd married one of the most dangerous men in America, and that trying to kill him was the last mistake she'd ever make as a free woman. The farm was waiting when Wilson returned home, peaceful and quiet under the afternoon sun. But now it represented something different. Not an escape from his past, but a base of operations for whatever came next. Operative Shadow was back, and America's enemies had no idea what was coming for them. Wilson Waters had learned that retirement was a luxury he couldn't afford as long as people like Margaret, Tony, and Rhonda were willing to betray everything that mattered for money and power. The quiet life would have to wait a little longer. But when his work was finally done, When the last enemy had been eliminated and the final conspiracy exposed, Wilson would return to his farm knowing that he'd earned the peace that came from justice served and debts paid in full. The war had come to his home, but he'd won it on his terms. And that, Wilson reflected as he walked toward his house, was exactly what he'd spent 20 years learning how to do.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.